All right, it's time for another episode of App Stories. We are going to close out the interview portion of our OS Summer Preview series today with an interview with Malin Sundberg, which we'll get to very shortly. But first, I want to say hello, Federico. How are you doing today?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing all right. I want to thank our three sponsors for the episode. The first is Concepts, which is a fantastic iPad app and the sponsor of the entire summer series, as well as Instabug and Technology Untangled. All right, Federico, without further ado, let's dive into this interview. We're here today with Malin Sundberg, the developer of Orbit, a time tracking app for the iPhone, iPad, Mac, and Apple Watch. Welcome to the show, Malin.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, it's great to talk to you. I wanted to kick things off before we dive into some of the frameworks and things that were announced at WWDC this year and ask you a little bit about yourself and your app Orbit, because not all listeners may have tried Orbit before, but why don't you give listeners an idea of what it does and when it, what you've been working on with it recently.
Yeah, sure. Just some background about myself. I'm originally from Sweden, but I moved a bit. So I lived in Australia, and now I'm in Vancouver, Canada.
Oh, wow.
So I've been, if you pick up an accent, that's why it's a bit of a mix between all of those. And I started doing iOS development basically. Back then I was in Australia when it was released, so it was the night of the keynote. So I watched the keynote probably at 2 a.m. for me, and then the State of the Union, and then I started downloading Xcode and everything so that I could start learning Swift and start iOS development directly. And I sort of saw that as a really cool point to get into iOS development, because I could be there with like the new framework and be there along the ride, and it was a bit bumpy in the beginning. With a lot of things changing from version to version of Swift. But I think in the beginning of 2019, I started doing more time tracking in general. And I needed to have an app that I could use for my freelance work. So I want to have an app that worked well on macOS. I want to have an app for both time tracking and invoicing. So that's actually what Orbit does. It does both of those components. And I couldn't find a good app that did both of those. And there were many apps that might be focusing more on web or more on iOS, but I did all of my main work on the Mac, so it made sense to have a good Mac experience, and that's always what I've been caring about. I want to have a good app on the platform that I'm working on. And then when SwiftUI came out, then my partner and I, who are working on Orbit together, we thought, okay, maybe this is the perfect opportunity to stress test the framework. And we thought if we can make an app work with SwiftUI on macOS, then we can work with it everywhere, right? So we started with that. We built an app. We thought it would be relatively straightforward, but it ended up taking some time in the beginning because SwiftUI was pretty new back then, so it was a bit of things to learn. But then I think we ended up shipping the Mac app within 4 months, 3 or 4 months. That was including the backend. And then when we were done with that, we released our iOS app as well. I think that took us about 1 month to build that. And that was something we started with that after WWDC last year, so we could use some of the newer parts of the framework, which was a huge improvement, and there was a really good improvement since then as well. A lot of things have changed. But it's been really fun. I think it was similar to the Swift journey. It was pretty cool to be able to be there from the beginning and see it developing, see it changing. Yeah, so now we have an app both for the Mac, iOS, iPadOS, and watchOS more recently. And the sort of key idea of Orbit is that it's an app that you can use as freelancers to track time. And the idea is that it should be a good experience on all of those platforms. And we try to use that. So for example, on the Mac, we have a idle detection. So if you step away from your computer, then you're able to get an idle detection when you come back, and we can remove time that you might have tracked accidentally. And on the iPhone, on the other hand, we have things like a widget that is giving a good grasp of the time that you've been tracking as well. So we really try to use like native things and specific parts for the platforms to make a good experience there.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask about that, Malin. So you started on the Mac and then you expanded onto other platforms. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to dig a little deeper into that. So how is it being to sort of approach these other devices, right? So bringing Orbit to the iPhone, to the iPad, and then to the Apple Watch. What were the challenges in doing that and sort of having to rethink the core experience, coming from the Mac and saying, okay, how does this feature or this design make sense on iPhone? Whereas how does it make sense on Apple Watch? What was that process like for you?
So picking up iOS after making the Mac app was a lot more straightforward. And I think that was partly because we were more familiar with the framework. But I'm very happy that we started making the Mac app because since neither my partner and I knew AppKit, that really forced us to stick with it. So we learned the ins and outs of the framework on one platform. And then even though we knew UIKit, we actually had gotten the benefits of SwiftUI, and we saw how quick it was to build things with it once we got used to it. And we decided to continue with SwiftUI there. And I think it took us about a month to create the iOS app based on that. And the thing I think you should consider when you build with SwiftUI isn't necessarily that you will be able to reuse components. That is one benefit of it. But I think the key thing is that you will be able to use the same framework, and there's a lot less friction there. You don't have to change between AppKit and UIKit. And another benefit that we got, which we didn't think would be a thing at all, was that we could actually have our Mac app, running pretty much directly on iOS during the development process. So for example, in the beginning, we didn't know what we wanted our sign-up flow and our onboarding flow to look like, but we were able to use the Mac components, which didn't look good, and that's not what we wanted to ship. But we could use that to make sure that the whole flow is there, and then we could use that to work on individual components. So we started out working on the time tracking part of the app, which we knew we wanted. We knew what we wanted it to look like. And then when we were done with that part and we were done with the core part of the app, we were able to get into that very quickly and log in, use our current macOS flow, and just start building. And then when we were happy with the core app, we could go back and do the whole sort of onboarding part or the whole sign-in part, which we didn't see as a potential benefit before, but that actually really helped us be able to get up and running on the new platform and then iterate from there and then adopt the UI and make the UI feel good and at home on the new platform.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I wanted to ask you about SwiftUI in particular and dig into that a little deeper because, I've talked to a lot of developers who are very excited about SwiftUI, but many of them have been frustrated by it at times as well. And I think from what I gather, it seems as though it's one of those things where you have to kind of pick the places you want to use it carefully at this point in the stage in its development. Is that been your experience, or what overall has your experience been like starting with from ground one with an app that was designed for that framework?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I always struggle going back to it because I know there are still many. I guess I struggle suggesting what to do because my experience had its ups and downs, but overall I come out of even the Mac app, which was early days of SwiftUI. We released it a week before WWDC 2020, so that was the first version of SwiftUI. Right. But even after that, I came out of it, and I remember there being lots of frustration points where we tried to get the framework to do what we wanted it to do, and we tried to get it to work on that particular platform. But afterwards, I felt really excited about it, and I felt like that's what I wanted to continue using. So I guess the fact that even if there were those sort of walls that you're hitting now and then, and those frustration points, the fact that I still came out of it feeling positive was a good thing. But I think it depends a lot on your scenario. So for us, it was, if I would start a new app today, no matter if it's iOS or macOS, even if I do know UIKit, I would still start with SwiftUI and try to get as much done as possible with that. And then once you're comfortable with the language, with the framework, there will be a lot of things that you notice are missing, but you will also build up your own sort of toolkit for that. Mm-hmm. So something that we had, for example, with iOS 14 was that we wanted fields to be focusable, which we got them now this year with iOS 15. But back then there wasn't a way for you to move between different text fields easily. So you couldn't change the focus of them to, for example, if you start with the email field and then want to go to a password field, you couldn't traverse through those very easily. And that was something that we built our own component for. And once you figure out the things that might be missing or the things that you might have to add your own UIKit wrappers for, you will feel a lot more comfortable using the framework because you know where it shines and where you have some limitations. But that's all you sort of have to I guess it's like a bit that you have to practice it or you have to get used to it in order to find those things.
Sure.
And in reality, many people are going to be in a scenario where they already have an app right there. Everyone isn't starting building new apps from scratch, even though I think many of us would love to. So I think just getting started with learning it on things like widgets in certain screens and those things, and especially if you can support iOS 14 or iOS 15 only or monoray only, then I think that's a great option to like pick it up for a new feature or for a new UI that you're building. And then when you're used to it, then next time you pick up your next app, I think I would definitely go ahead and use SwiftUI for it, even though there are some limitations. But once you're aware of them, you get a lot of the benefits as well.
This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Concepts. Sketch, note, and explore endless ideas with Concepts' Infinite Canvas for iPad. Draw in designer Copic colors with liquid pens and brushes, and organize images, text, and sketches into visual mood boards. Used by creative professionals for visual thinking, note-taking, team communication, storyboarding, product design, and architectural planning, Concepts lets you sketch and share your ideas in the moment. Everything you draw in Concepts is a flexible, editable vector. Nudge, edit, and reorganize your ideas with natural figure gestures. Drag and drop images and objects onto the canvas for fast ideation and reference. Use layers and grid layouts to organize your work, mark up PDF documents, and apply real-world scale to professional design projects. Export and share standard high-resolution and vector files for flexible work between teams and apps. Concepts built-in presentation mode lets you connect with others for live sharing and graphic-based discussion. Whiteboard visually with teams and clients using apps like Zoom and instantly share your discussion. The app comes free as a basic sketching tool with the ability to unlock 200-plus libraries of brushes, objects, and services via a subscription or one-time purchase. To learn more about Concepts, visit their website today at concepts.app. Listeners of App Stories can enjoy a special 1-month extended free trial when you sign up for an annual subscription. There'll be a link in the show notes. Again, that URL is concepts.app to try this terrific Infinite Canvas app for iPad. Our thanks to Concepts for their support of App Stories and our Summer OS series.
We've been talking a little bit about Orbit's UI and how that was built with SwiftUI on all the platforms where it runs. But I'm curious, too, about the underlying logic of the app. And you started on the Mac.
Mm-hmm.
Was there ever any thought to perhaps starting on the iPad or the iPhone and then coming over to the Mac with Catalyst? Why the direction you went, I guess? Mm-hmm. Because I think we talk to an awful lot of developers who start on iOS and end up on the Mac eventually. It's probably more rare for us to see people who have gone the other direction.
Yeah, I know, and I think that's more common because many people are. I mean, there are a lot more iOS apps and iOS developers,
True.
So it is an easier sort of direction to approach it from, or a more obvious direction. I think for us, it was, I mean, we knew that we wanted to make an iOS app, but the priority was to get a really good Mac app. And we knew that there were some limitations back then with Catalyst apps and the way that you could, like, the flexibility of it. And we just felt like SwiftUI was a good opportunity for us to make something and get started with that framework, but then easily bridge over if we needed that. So that's something that I think has been helpful for us, especially in like the Catalina days of macOS. We were able to combine SwiftUI and then move over to AppKit. So, for example, the way that we're presenting Windows, or even on Catalina, we have our settings screen, which wasn't a thing in SwiftUI's early days. That was something that we did in AppKit, and that's what we liked, that flexibility around it. And we just thought that if we can use one framework for that and then move over to iOS, we knew that we wanted the experience to be very different on the platforms anyways. So we very much saw it as an option for us to have one framework that we're using and potentially being able to reuse some components. But the idea was to start out with the Mac app, and then we didn't really know what we wanted the app to look like on iOS or iPadOS. So we were just happy if we were able to use some components. So for example, our graphs in our app are very, they're pretty custom looking. They are specifically designed for our app. It's nothing that is like a UI component on the iPhone or on the Mac. So that was a component that we were able to reuse. So that was a benefit that we got there. But we could really use it as a sort of, I guess, like a box of Lego. Or I guess if you would, let's say you would, I think you can think of SwiftUI as like a bunch of spices that you would use for different foods when you're cooking. And if you started making one dish, you might make a chili, then you know that you want like certain spices for that. And then you might want to make butter chicken, and some of the spices are the same, but you're not expected to use everything across both of the dishes, right? So I think that's sort of, so that's why I think SwiftUI could be, or what I think it is. You have sort of your selection, and you have your like kit of components that you can pick from. So in Orbit, we have things like the dashboard, things like the invoicing screen and certain parts of the invoicing screen. And we build it in that way that we have certain components that we can then like use on the different platforms. But it was very much structured that way. And that's the way like SwiftUI encourages you to structure the code, like split everything up into components. And then you get some benefits of having that as a toolkit that you can then use on the different platforms as you move into different platforms, rather than designing something that should work out of the box for all of the platforms.
So Malin, I was just checking out the Orbit website, and one of the things I noticed is that you have a public roadmap. You have a Trello board where you're publicly showing all the things you're working on, the things that are in progress, the things that are coming next. What is it like to develop, apps like this in public, having a public roadmap? And how does it affect like your relationship with customers of the app, and sort of how you listen to feedback and how you incorporate that feedback into the roadmap?
I'm quite happy that we have it public. It hasn't cost, like no one's ever been upset about it. I think people are quite happy to see that we have it publicly. And the reason why we did that was, especially in the beginning, we knew that we had a lot of things planned for Orbit, but we also wanted to be able to provide it and make it available as soon as possible. So even if we only had a Mac app, we wanted to show people where we are heading. So if you are a person who is specifically looking for a Mac app, but you also want an iOS app, we want to encourage people to decide, like make the decision based on what our roadmap looks like. And that is partly because something like a time tracking and invoicing app is sort of, you bring your whole business there and you start to create a system for you that you're hopefully going to be able to use in a longer time frame or for a longer period. And that is quite a commitment. It's the same when you start to use a new to-do list app. And I think it's always a hassle to move between different to-do list apps. And that's how we felt that we didn't want to give people the idea that, let's say someone really wants a Windows app. We didn't want them to think that like that is on our roadmap or be unaware that it's not on our roadmap. But if they are looking for an iOS app, then that is on our roadmap. So we just wanted to be very sort of open about what our plan is, because we are a 2-people team as well. So we can't get to everything directly. So we wanted to sort of give people an idea of when those things are coming before they make the decision. And then if they want the Mac app on day one, they have that. If there's a specific feature like export functionality or custom invoice colors, and that's something they think they need in the future, then we have it on our roadmap and they can make the decision and see like, is it worth waiting for, or should I go with something else, or is it not at all on the roadmap? And then that was just the transparency that we wanted. I mean, we also always have things coming up. To answer your question with like how customers impact it as well, there are, when we get customer questions and we think that makes sense for a lot of people. So for example, rounding of time entries was something that many people asked for, and we didn't have that on our roadmap. Then we ended up adding that and bumping that up in priority because it was something many people wanted. And after we released that, people sent us messages being very happy about it. And we just sort of try to keep it a living document, because we know that things will come up, or when iOS 15 comes out, there are new things coming up that we wouldn't have known about back in May, for example. So it's definitely not set in stone, and we do add things as we see it fit.
This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Instabug. Building mobile apps presents some challenges. Bugs, crashes, and performance issues can be a nightmare for developers. But what if you could not only detect all of those issues, but understand the quality of your app from your user's point of view? Instabug's lightweight SDK grabs all of the insights you need to build quality apps through comprehensive bug and crash reports, performance monitoring, and real-time user feedback, all in one SDK. With Instabug, you can continuously monitor and measure the performance of your app as perceived by your users, engage with your users by letting them report issues and questions from right inside your app, get all of the information you need about bugs, crashes, and other issues, and fix issues in record time, all with a focus on privacy and security. And you don't have to worry about the hassle of switching to a new tool because Instabug works with the tools you already use and your current workflow because it supports things like Jira, Slack, Trello, GitHub, Zendesk, or whatever else you use to handle issues. Join 25,000 top mobile developers around the world who use Instabug to ship high-quality apps. Go to try.instabug.com/appstories. Again, that URL to check out Instabug is try.instabug.com/appstories. Our thanks to Instabug for their support of the show.
So I wanted to get a little deeper into the Mac, which may be a surprise coming from me. What is not a surprise is that I want to talk about shortcuts. So there's shortcuts coming to Monterey. Have you I assume you're considering shortcuts integration with Orbit, and sort of how are you approaching this right now?
Yeah, I actually started working on it. I think last week I started, and it's something that I was super excited about when I heard. And I'm not as heavy of a shortcuts user as you, Federico, but I think no one is. But I've been really excited about shortcuts in general. And I think the thing with Orbit is that I'm more encouraged to work out, to make that as a feature now because I know that I can make it on all the platforms. And I started making a shortcut. The first shortcuts we have is a shortcut to resume a timer that you started earlier in the day and stop a timer that's currently running. And then later on, we also want to add, or before the release, we also want to add like creating a new timer and setting the properties or passing in the values that you want to that so that you can create something directly from the shortcut. And that was something I just felt made a lot of sense to make now because we can provide it to users on all the platforms. And since we are already across all the platforms, I like to provide a feature that makes sense on all of the platforms, on those platforms as well. So we're definitely going to add that. And one thing that I think is exciting is that it's going in line with the same approach that we've seen with SwiftUI. You can learn the tool both as a developer but also as a user on one platform, and then you can use it everywhere. So I really think we can see Apple's direction here. And that's something that I was excited about for SwiftUI as well this year at WWDC. We can really see Apple pointing in it, like being easier for you to build for everything. And that comes to shortcut as well, like create shortcuts that is available across all the platforms. And I think that's really exciting and really useful as well as a user.
Yeah, that's definitely a trend that we've noticed over the last few years. And you know what's neat about it to me is that it really makes it possible for people like yourself to start on the Mac and work your way over to iOS, or for people to start on iOS and work their way over to the Mac. I mean, you know, in the past, we've had things like back to the Mac and other marketing terms from Apple where it was like they were one or the other platforms was always catching up to the other one, and there was always something missing. And it was hard, I think, for developers who were trying to be across all platforms to explain to customers, well, yeah, you can do this on our iPhone app, but you can't do it on the Mac. I mean, have you had any of those kind of things come up with Orbit before this?
I don't think there's anything particular that we don't have.
Well, that's good. That's a smart approach, I think.
But we do definitely have a focus that's different on the two. So like invoicing, for example, and the way that you can see you can view and create invoice on both platforms, but I think the experience is very different on a Mac because we make it like the invoice creation looks very much like an invoice, and it's laid out in the way that you would expect it to look like on a letter once you print it out, if you want to print it out.
Right.
Or in a PDF. Whereas on iOS, it's more focused on like ease of input, and we just have the layout specifically for that platform. So we definitely thought of that in terms of the way that we display features. And the same with like the way that you look at time entries. They are very glanceable on the iOS and iPad app. They're very colorful there. Whereas on the Mac, they're a bit more discreet because we think it might be a window you have open in the background and you don't want to have those colors like in your vision all the time.
Sure.
Yeah, so we definitely try to make those different for that.
One thing that I'd love to see possible on iOS and iPadOS is the kind of idle detection that you're doing on the Mac, because I think for time tracking, that's a really powerful feature on the Mac, but unfortunately nobody can do that on an iPad or an iPhone.
Yeah. But I think that's where shortcuts comes in, which I think could be really cool. So if we can have a shortcut that is triggered by a change of your location, that would work quite similarly.
Sure.
So in the way that or even when you arrive somewhere, once people start traveling more, or once people start going into offices when COVID is over, we actually want to have a shortcut or suggest a shortcut to users that when you arrive at this office, start this timer for this particular client, because you might always work from the client's office. So those type of things are things that we were thinking of making in the past and building ourselves. But I think that's a perfect option for shortcuts and something that you can. We're trying to build our shortcuts that way so that you can really fit them well on each platform as well and use them how it works. So use them for the platform in the way the platform is intended. So something that's on your phone is on the go. So hooking that into a location makes a lot of sense, while as on the Mac, maybe having something that integrates with your focus modes make a lot of sense as well, because that's something you probably want to turn off and on quite frequently on your Mac.
Right. Yeah, that's one of the things I think is so powerful about shortcuts and it being on all the platforms now too, is that it really lets people use your app in ways that you may not have ever really imagined, but it works particularly with the way that they happen to work.
Yeah. I think that's really cool. And as I'm starting to use shortcuts more now when I'm building it as well, I found all those ideas that would be like very cool use case for me, and might not be something that the way that everyone will use it. So sometimes I go for a walk and I have that as a meeting. So my partner and I, we live together and we work on Orbit together, and we often have walking meetings. So I might want to have a shortcut that starts an outdoor walk and then automatically starts a timer, which is very niche for me, and it's not a feature that we would build for everyone, but with shortcuts, it's something we can combine there as a user of our own app. So I think that is really cool and we really try to make our shortcuts flexible so that you can combine them with those different actions.
This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Technology Untangled. Finding a new podcast to listen to is one of my favorite things. Maybe you're new to App Stories and you've had that experience recently too. Well, I've got an absolutely great podcast you should definitely try, and that's Technology Untangled. The show is hosted by Michael Bird, and it's all about deciphering tech's rapid evolutions with one simple question in mind. What's really going to shape our future, and what's going to wind up in the bargain bin with the floppy disk? I've listened to a couple of different recent episodes and loved them. The first episode was about quantum computing, which I loved because whenever I read about quantum computing, the articles are all hand-wavy about the underlying technology. But Technology Untangled, in contrast, explained the big deal about quantum computing in clear and understandable terms. The other episode I listened to was about the blockchain. It's similarly confusing. It's something that no article I've read does a really good job of explaining. But again, Technology Untangled got into the details, but explained them in a way that was understandable. It was terrific. If you love to learn and want to understand today's technology, this is the podcast for you. Other topics covered include things like a deep dive into 5G that untangles the who's and what's and why's and how's of 5G and what it means to you, how supercomputers are helping us with the fight against COVID by sifting through billions of molecules to look for drugs to repurpose, and episodes about AI, the future of jobs, and energy innovation and the mission to Mars. The show has a lot of great guests, too, including people from Google, Sainsbury's, Aston Martin, Red Bull Racing, Good Hilly Earth Station, and the New York Times and Nokia. Michael Bird has interviewed over 50 super interesting people this year. Think technologists, scientists, academics, developers, futurists, and IT generalists. And in the final episode of Technology Untangled, you can hear about the one innovation almost all guests couldn't stop talking about, as well as learning how to prepare for tomorrow's innovations today. Search for Technology Untangled anywhere you listen to podcasts, and I'll include a link in the show notes too. Once again, go to your podcast player and search for Technology Untangled and listen to this terrific show. Our thanks to Technology Untangled for their support of the show. At WWDC this year, there wasn't one of those really big features that you just knew third-party developers were going to be all over in the fall. I mean, last year we had widgets, and it was pretty clear to us, at least, coming out of WWDC, that a lot of people would be building widgets, and that turned out to be the case. There wasn't so much that kind of thing this year, I don't think. What do you think people will be doing this fall? What kinds of things did you see at WWDC that got you excited?
It's a good question. I think I am very excited because I've been using so much SwiftUI. But there are many I guess developer life improvements that we can see. But if you try, Apple usually has lists like best apps with widgets or great apps with this particular feature. And I also been wondering what will that will there be a list like that, great apps with async await is something that we're
Right.
not kind of thing. But I think shortcuts is probably one of the features that many people are will be starting to look at, and how they can add that to their apps, especially if you do have it across multiple platforms. But it might be a bit more of a slow growth than compared to something like widgets. I think widgets just blew up a lot more than I think even Apple anticipated. And you saw things like _David Smith, he developed an app that became really popular, and people started using custom widgets a lot. And I think it was something that we didn't see as much, but it was just a fun new component. So I think there will still be more widgets, especially on the iPad. I think there are more things you can do there. You can almost create if you have an iPad, you might be able to put widgets together so that you have your almost like a dashboard of your favorite apps with bigger widgets and those type of things. I think there might be, in terms of things for developers, there is the Xcode Cloud. I think is going to be one of those cool things that are going to be really useful for developers. There are a lot of new things in App Store or for in-app purchases and the in-app purchase APIs, which I think are not necessarily, again, this feature that's big for people who use the app, but it's going to make it so much easier to, that part of an app is quite tedious to build, and I think many developers will be more comfortable building, with the way they're building their in-app purchases. So it's more of a benefit for developers, right? What do you two think is going to be a bigger thing in terms of the way you use apps? Is there anything that you're excited about from WWDC?
That's a good question. Well, shortcuts for Mac for sure. I want to say maybe widgets on iPad, just because it's the new feature on iPad and you got the new XL widget size. I would say probably SharePlay. It's not a feature that I particularly care about. It feels like I would have loved this feature last year, and I would have really used that feature last year when we were in lockdown twice in Italy. It feels like it's technically remarkable, just maybe a bit late, but I feel like Apple is still going to promote, apps that take advantage of it.
Yeah, I agree. And I think I definitely agree with you. We had sometimes, I was trying to watch movies with my friends, so we tried to I think many people did that when they tried to resume the movie at the same time, and so I want to go and get popcorn, and everyone has to pause at the same time. So yes, I totally agree. It would have been really useful then. But I think even after the pandemic, I think many people will work differently. People will work more remotely. So in terms of work tools, that can be good. For me, who have family overseas, it's actually really helpful as well. Any tech support might be easier this way as well. Because sometimes they call me and they want help with their phones, and if I can do anything with a SharePlay session, that would be really cool.
Yeah.
But I agree. I think there are many apps there in different areas. You can have learning apps, work apps, or entertainment apps. There's so many that can use this, and I think you can use it in pretty creative ways. I'm also really excited to see what becomes available there, and I would love to make something as well, but it doesn't really fit into Orbit. But if I come up with another app separate from that, I think it will be a really fun framework to work with.
All right. So before we wrap up the show, Malin, so the dreaded question, can you share any future plans for Orbit with us? What are some of the things that Orbit users can expect in the future without revealing too much? I understand that pre-announcing things, I'm usually against it personally, but what can we expect from Orbit going forward?
Yeah, I'm happy to be transparent about what we're doing in general. So we are looking at new things for iOS 15 and macOS, of course. So the immediate things are shortcuts, both on iOS, iPadOS, and macOS. And then we also want to add bigger widgets and potentially have some widgets that display our dashboard as well, and use those larger ones on the iPad. And then we are planning a bigger sort of design revamp or design change on the Mac app as well. Because we're still supporting Catalina, we were holding off on on updating our UI to be having things like buttons at the top of the screen or at the top of the window, because we felt like that was something we really wanted, but it was hard to do that with SwiftUI. But now when we're going to drop Catalina support, we're going to do a redesign of the app to make it a bit more modern and feel at home at Big Sur and on Monterey. What else is there? There's also the always on the watch screen that we're going to support in the watch app, which I'm super excited about. It's something I've been wanting to have for a long time. So we want to have something that actually indicates what's running when the watch screen is still on. I think those are some of the quick notes as well.
Oh, nice.
It's something I'm excited about. Yeah.
Yeah, we're really excited about that too. It's something that we've been talking about and playing around with a lot. It's I think it's got a lot of potential, and I think I've already noticed because it's kind of the way it's built, there are already apps that support it. So it'll be interesting to see. I expect the uptake on that one is gonna be pretty broad based.
Yeah, I think so too. And when I saw the demos of that, I thought it was really cool, and it felt really intuitive as well. Like you just have a note related to what you're working on. So for example, in Orbit, you might be in the middle of creating an invoice to someone, but you want to give them a certain rate, or you're giving them a specific discount. Then we want to be able to like maybe have a note there, and like maybe you wrote down why you gave that discount. And then next time you go back to that invoice, you can see that note directly rather than like having to find that yourself. So that is a really cool thing that I'm excited to use myself as well in different apps, and just the context awareness there is going to be really cool.
Yeah, that's exactly how I've been using it for all sorts of different apps.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that's like the bigger things. There are, of course, a few other improvements that we got with SwiftUI that we're probably going to start adopting too, but those are the bigger features.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, Malin. I really want to thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today and talk to our listeners about what's coming in the fall. I always like hearing what people are working on, and it sounds like you've got some great plans for Orbit.
Yeah, of course. No, it was really, really fun to join you too. Thank you so much again for having me.
All right, everybody, that's it for this week. A special thanks again to Malin Sundberg for joining us for the interview today. And thanks too to Concepts, the great iPad app that has been our sponsor for the entire Summer OS preview series, as well as Instabug and Technology Untangled. You can find me and Federico over at macstories.net. Federico is over on Twitter and Instagram too. He's at Viticci. That's VITICCI. And I'm at John Voorhees. JOHNVOORHEES. Talk to you next week, Federico.
Ciao, John.